name is Erica Dyke. I teach 7th grade English in Watford City, and I'll be hosting. We'll go through this English playbook. The topic for today is atypical games in the English classroom. And so as I was thinking about what to share about, I realized that I am on a quest to find simplicity, because I feel like in education everything can get so complicated. And in my quest for simple, repeatable structures, I was talking with one of my friends who worked at a game store, and he said, well, a game really just relies on a simple, repeatable structure. And everybody seems to kind of know what a game is, and it's a very simple concept. So I started calling some things games, and maybe some things were atypical, and sometimes were a little bit more typical. So as we're going through here, if you ever have any an idea or comment, feel free to jump into the conversation, and just let's use this as a way to just kind of feed our imaginations, and maybe we might come up with a couple more games as we go along our chat. So, okay, so some games with literature specifically. This one is one of my favorite games. It's called the First Line, Last Line game. And when I was an undergrad, Dr. Miriam Mara at NDSU had us always go back to the first line after we'd finished reading a text. And then when I had her in grad school, she would have us look at the last line. And so it's really simple. So you just look at the first line, look at the last line, and then any new insights that you have. And so my favorite one to play with this is To Kill a Mockingbird. So whether you've read it or not, I just pulled the first line and the last line. So if you just want to read them, and then any insights that you have from this. So the first line: when he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. Last line: he, Atticus, would be there all night, and he'd be there when Jem waked up in the morning. So what do you see from first line to last line?
I love this because I love To Kill a Mockingbird, and as English teachers, we know the story when we read that first line, and we know that it's going to tell us at the end, so it's really cool to go back and look at it after the fact.
And then it has a really nice bookends to it.
Yeah, for sure.
One thing that I had never noticed before until I looked at this was that Jem, Jem's in the first line and Jem is in the last line. And so I always thought it was about Scout, as a coming of age about Scout, but I'm like, oh wait, maybe this book is about Jem and Scout's just our narrator. And I had never had that thought before. I'm like, whoa, that just completely blew my mind. So sometimes this game is awesome, and sometimes it flops. And I think just telling kids that sometimes this really works and sometimes it doesn't, but let's play the game. Let's play the game, the first line, last line game. It works for poems, it works for short stories, it works for anything that has a first line and a last line. I've even done it with a video where you look at the first image and the last image. And so then you kind of see okay, what was the first thing that they had you see? What was the last thing? And oftentimes you could take a look at change, what was the thing that changed from the first to the last, or even just maybe new insights. All of a sudden I'm maybe I need to think about Jem as a character a little bit more with the last line, first line game. So yeah.
This seems like a great way, when I'm always looking for new ways for students to share book love, and to just do some little sharing, mostly less for accountability and more so that other students get ideas for books that they want to read. Mm-hmm. And like you said, it doesn't work for every book, but I like to give kids options of how, what do you want to do to tell us a little bit about your book and kind of sell it to the class. And this would be such a simple additional option. And even if you did kind of what Penny Kittle does when she does a little book, she gets a new book, even if you've never read it as the teacher, and you're kind of promoting that book and asking, who wants to read this and test it out for the class. This could be an interesting little metric to use for those little quick, even if you've never read the book and no one knows what that connection is, who wants to find and string these two sentences together and then tell us about this book. So this is so simple.
Right. Simple, very, very powerful. And so interesting that you say connections, connect first line to the last line. I just started calling this the connect text to self, text to other text, and text to the world, which, total disclaimer is not anything. It's out there a lot with different things. But what I added was the word game, was just adding that we're going to play the connections game, and then giving it a name gives it that repeatability and then the rules to govern it. So then we would just, with my sophomores, because I mainly developed these with my sophomores last year. And so there's just kind of like, they knew exactly what to do. And then we posted some things on the bulletin board or the whiteboard, but I have like a space for it to be in there. But just like calling it a game, all of a sudden kind of shifts a little bit the thinking of it, just a simple, repeatable, we know what we have to do. Because I think sometimes it's easy to kind of fall into the trap of like having new ways of going through thinking. And maybe that's just me, but it's like there's different things that we can do to think. But really, if we can just get really good at some really simple, repeatable things and just do them well. So that's why I started calling them games. So, yeah. So, and the next one is very similar. It's the mirror window door game. I don't know if you're all familiar with the metaphor that literature is a window, mirror, and a sliding door. And so with window, we see a new world. And with a mirror, we see ourselves back. And a sliding door, it opens up a different, it's like more action oriented. And so I use this a lot with my sophomores, like, was this text a mirror, a window, or a door for you, and why? And so it's a very personal response. Sometimes kids struggle with that because it wasn't like I can't just like look someplace and it'll give me the answer for it. But just calling it once again a game, like the mirror, window, and door game. And then one of my freshmen was like, oh, it's like a car. I'm like, what? And they said, yeah, because like you're driving a car and you have the windows that like sometimes you let in fresh air and you see where you're going, but you also have the mirrors to help you look back. And then you've got the doors so you can get in and out of the car. And I'm like, oh, wow, that was really deep thinking. And then she just made a case of why literature was kind of like driving a car. And I was like, huh, that was a very unexpected little thing that came out of that. So, yeah. But, okay. Then this one, the what, how, why game is just trying to simplify, because we're always asking kids to make a claim and back it up with evidence and say why it's important. And this one, when I was teaching grad school and I was in grad school and I was teaching English 120, trying to do the rhetorical analysis. And one of the doctoral students just said, oh, don't overcomplicate it. It's just what do you know, how do you know it, and why is it important? And I was like, oh, that really is as simple as what do you know, how do you know it, and why is it important? And then if you just like kind of like frame that like what, how, why, and just kind of, I don't always use the term game with this one, but as I was thinking, I'm like, it is kind of a game though. It's like a very simple, repeatable, you train them that these are the rules of this. What do you know?
I like that you can use that one for any ability level as well.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they might not get the really deep stuff, they might get something simple and feel confident for sharing that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's like a life skill. What do you know? It's hot in here. How do you know it? Well, I'm sweating. I'm drinking more water. And why is that important? You need to go turn the thermostat down, So it's just kind of
This could have a very game format to it. If you were using your Google Classroom or your Microsoft Teams, every kid could post a claim in the discussion, or in a chat, right? And then they would have to go, or you could do this on Flipgrid, or you could do this on Post-it notes, or you could do this in think, pair, share groups, so many ways to facilitate it. But every student could have to start class with a claim, share that with the class in some way, hang them up around the room, or like I said, use a digital format. And then every kid has to go somewhere else and they have to support it with evidence, and then they have to rotate again and they have to support with another piece of evidence, and then they have to rotate again and they have to support it with another piece of evidence, and then in the last round they have to do why is this important. So there would be so many ways. I love the simplicity of these things, because Becky's right. This can work for any like level of student, like any range of thinker.
Yes, and my students love to win, if you will. It would be very easy to assign point values to certain levels of claims. It would be very easy to give them think like a higher order thinking questioning pyramid and just show that to the students and say, well, where is this question on here? If that was your question, you get 3 points. If it was a more basic question, you get 1 point, or whatever you decide to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, that could be another round in the game where they have to assign point values to the claims to identify, like you said. So that's working another skill of understanding these higher order thinking questions. But whether you use technology or post-it notes or posters or like whatever, this could be a really dynamic activity to do, and you're practicing so many writing skills.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just put my kids in pods, and I'm just even thinking like, man, we could just move from pod to pod, and each pod could be a different claim. Just maybe you just planned out my tomorrow. Revise my lesson plan for tomorrow, Darcy. Okay. So the next one, I only have one real thing within this grammar mechanics and usage game, and it actually didn't begin as one. And this one is a more digital thing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in a digital format, but it's kind of cool. So I really like choose your own adventure stories, and on one of the Facebook groups I was a part of, it had like a tutorial of how to use Google Forms to create a branch story, and which is what a choose your own adventure game is. And so I had them do that for Romeo and Juliet. So like, what if they made different choices, and then they had to branch it out. And then after we did that, I said, okay, because we were using IXL and they weren't like super crazy about IXL. So I said, let's make a story out of the things we're working on with IXL. And so then they had to, let's see, is it gonna come? They had to then make the, to advance the story, you had to choose the right grammatical form, like choose the sentence with a participial phrase to find out what happens next. And then a lot of them had like a help button. So before I get too far in, let me just see if it'll load. And I did put this under the, on the NDCT website, we have a shared knowledge folder. And so I created a games folder. And this is just, it's my rough draft. It's of the how to do this. And I really, really liked how it worked out. So I do have there's like, it's a 5-minute video about how to actually do the branched stories, if you're interested in that. Okay, so this is just, this was the Romeo and Juliet one. So it just has, I just took pictures. I had them do, I had all these writing jars. And so then I had to pick some challenge words. And then I just showed them like, this is how I outlined it on paper first. And they had to have a link that followed the decisions that Romeo and Juliet took. So that's what the top line is. But then on the bottom line, and some kids got really into this, and one kid wrote a whole fight scene. But it's using sections. So Romeo makes different decisions, but doesn't make a difference. Okay. And then it tells you, tell the story. Da, 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 da. You're Romeo. What do? You decide to go to the party. You decide to go home and write a book of poetry to channel your emotions. And so then you read that, and then how do you decide to share your poetry? You decide to share your book of poetry with Friar Lawrence to get some feedback. And then, so it just keeps going, and then eventually you'll get to the end, and then it just to the end, and you'll have to like submit the form. But I thought, wow, this is it's pretty simple, and that if you're interested in it, that tutorial will show you how to like create different sections to do that. But then when I introduced the other part where so I called it a prototype. I said, you have to prototype this, because I didn't quite know how it was fully working. And a couple of people chose different ones, but then it was like, they wrote a story, but then that story they had to choose, they built in like participial phrases, or, you know, whatever they were working on, like choose that one to unlock the next step. Or if you want to play as Molly, then choose the sentence with the infinitive. If you want to play as George, choose the sentence with the predicate noun. So that was, I didn't find my samples of those. I'll have to like maybe build another one of those. But the Google Forms and the branch story is really, I mean, it's kind of like a video game. One of my kids who's really into video games, he actually wrote like this fight scene where there was only one way through it. So it was interesting that he like said, choose, so Romeo was fighting, him fighting somebody, and then he's like, what do? Do you like jump back, or do you parry, or whatever? But it was very complicated, and he got very into it, but he was very much into video games. So for him, it was kind of like creating a little bit of a video game within Google Forms. So, okay, yeah, so that's in there. And then some writing games. Chase an idea game. This one, I've done it like both ways, but sometimes kids they need time to think, but they don't really know how to use writing to think fully. So I found setting timers works wonderfully. And so with this Chase an Idea game, I've done it with starting with 3 minutes. So it's just like, okay, so maybe you're talking about conflict in a story. And so like you start off with like, okay, everyone, we're gonna start writing about this conflict, and then we're writing for 3 minutes. And then at the end of 3 minutes, just go back and find one word. Just one word that you think is important from what you just wrote. You're gonna set a timer for 2 minutes. We're gonna write again, 2 minutes. And it's okay. I tell them it's okay if they don't connect. If you go in a completely different direction, it is okay. And then circle another word, write for 1 minute, and then keep going. And then at the end of it, sometimes we play the first line, last line game. And sometimes some brilliant things happen, and sometimes nothing happens. But sometimes I reverse the process. So start with 1 minute timer, and then write, and then circle one word, and then write for 2 minutes, circle one word, write for 3 minutes. And then sometimes kids do ask, can I just keep writing with what I'm going with? And I'm like, yes, you can. Like, just keep writing with what you're going with. So, but I find the time, and a lot of games are timed. Like there's a lot of like time boundness happening with games. So this one is fairly simple, and sometimes the thinking that comes out of it is really good. So thoughts, questions? Okay, so this one I found, this is a 30 circles test. I was listening to a TED Talk, Tim Brown's TED Talk about creativity. And so if you Google 30 seconds test, or 30 circles test, you'll find you're just supposed to set a timer for 2 minutes. And you're supposed to make like each circle into something creative, like turn it into like donuts, or like bicycles, or smiley faces, and so sometimes, usually the first time I give it to him, that's what we do. And it's kind of fun to see the kids, what they do with the different circles. But then you could also use these circles as like putting different categories into each column. And then you could totally make up like a story game. So then you have, like with this one, I just put different columns with different things, and then I put the rows numbered. And I haven't done this a ton in class. I've done it a few times, but then like kids have to pick something from each row and then they can make a story. Well, I think this is the beauty of this thing, is that you can just set the game and just say, you know, this time we're doing it, you can take one from each one. Or you could even set the limit of you have to take one from each column and one from each, or like you have to hit 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So you can't take all of them from 1 and all from 2, all from 3, all from 4, all from 5. And I think kids could also come up with different things here. Cause I mean, you don't have to put nouns if you're working on like concrete versus abstract nouns, or, you know, whatever concept you're working with, you could put those in there and then have them make them I mean, it's giving limits is really what it's doing. And the kids work really well within limits, because then they don't have to make as many decisions, because writers are ultimately decision makers. And so if you limit the decisions they make, they can make it shine. Although some of my freshmen last year, because I had a lot of like, I had writing jars. And so at the end of the year, I kept like having them pull challenge words that they had to incorporate into it. And some of them were like, oh, this is so easy. Like, can we just write our own? And other people were like, no, this is good and awesome. And so it was kind of a little bit like one kid wanted to not use the jars as much. They wanted to just go off, which was fantastic. So, yeah. But, well, then I've actually had, I let my sophomores, for one of their tests, I said, okay, so if you want to take this and you want to like outline your paper or like have like different notes, and if you want to use that on your test, you can do that. And so some kids really like use this as a nice outline, because each circle, you can only contain so much thought in there. And so then they could also like connect things, and some of them like put boundaries around different dots. And yeah.
I guess I've never used a game before, but I would really like this, where they put the, you know, talking about your grammar with the nouns, adjectives, adverbs. I think it would be a great idea. And then connecting that to a writing game. And my kids would love it because it's called a game too.
And even I just recently been thinking about like maybe story is game, because it's a simple, repeatable structure. And that was like, oh, like maybe at the core of it really is just like story. And sometimes, yeah, I don't know.
I like that. Story is game. I've never done it like this. I really like Erica's 30 circles test, but something that I've done with the whole concept of story as game is I like to play musical stories. Concept of musical chairs, although nobody gets a chair taken away from them, but circle, you start writing. Everybody has their notebook and they start writing. And then as soon as they hear music, you stop writing, you set your notebook down and you walk in your circle. And then when the music stops, you sit down and you pick up where that person left off in their story.
Huh.
And then we just do it for a majority of a class period. And then they like to share their stories and they just laugh at them. They think they're so funny.
Huh.
Rebecca, do you start with a story starter? I didn't hear the first part. Or do you
you
just start whatever?
Let them start with whatever, I guess.
That's a good idea.
I could see it being interesting though, Sean, in an elementary school classroom, if every child started with the same sentence, you know, so you give them one opening sentence and then they write. And then, like, what a cool way to show, I mean, this kind of connects back to Erica's Divergent Stories activity. What a cool way to see and look at how one little phrase, or you could even, back to Erica's point too, even just start with an image, right? And they have to tell a story about that picture. So everyone is starting with the same seed and see how it grows in such wildly different directions. I just think that that's a cool and fun experiment.
I do that when we do dialogue. When we teach dialogue and writing conversations, I give them the same first line, which is, "Where were you last night?" And then they come up with writing dialogue with that first given line. And then they come up with very different things based on how they use that, interpret that.
Okay, so I just put this, my friend Chris Harvey in Hazen helped me like kind of, he makes videos. So we put together these little, like 3 little writing videos. And so I realized that a lot of the stuff that I used these writing jars, like when kids were stuck, because sometimes kids just don't know what to do. But basically I just had jars and they were labeled with like concrete nouns, abstract nouns, active verbs. And I had them color coded as well. I didn't have time to go get like a picture of them. I don't have them in my classroom this year yet. But it was really helpful. So like if your kid, like a kid just needed a jump start, or even like you could have started a game like with the musical chairs or musical stories, like you could just have like, you know, grabbed a couple, like grabbed a word or grabbed a different, something to get you going, or to kind of challenge you to go in a different direction. So we're not gonna, oh no. Okay, so the next one was, I started changing my bulletin board into like kind of thinking differently about my bulletin board with different writing games. And so I started using yarn and just kind of like creating different, the first thing I was trying to set up my bulletin board to create a branch story, like a choose your own adventure. That's what I was originally starting for. But then I realized that it was going to get a little bit more complicated and maybe the bulletin board wasn't going to have as much space. So then I just, what I did was I took from the writing jars, so like they're color coded, you can kind of see. And then I had them roll dice, and they then had a path, and different things were with different points. And so the ending was pre-written. So at the very end of the bulletin board was a pre-written ending that everybody had to get to. And they were in teams. And so then they had all these different, I call them story dots, to connect along the way. And then they had to all get to the end, same ending. So I do have my directions in that link that's right up there. It's in the games thing. And so there's a lot of different ways you could do that. And then I create my myths and legends, we did the hero's journey. And so then I divide it into 12. So then there are 12 parts to the hero's journey. And so then they had to like hit all those different things in the different compartments. And so then they had to also use the hero's journey pattern. And they actually really liked having more limits on them than not. They liked it with the hero's journey because then they didn't have to make as many decisions, and they could just let the story template take over. But yeah, so I guess I really like the idea of giving kids limits. And this was developed out of my creative writing class 2 years ago. We were trying to write a collaborative novel, and we failed miserably. And it didn't go. And so I asked one kid, I said, how are we going to, like, we need a closure, we need an end. And she's like, well, we could just write the ending. So we did just write the ending, and we had it outlined. And so we just then ended up like with kind of like a story game instead of a whole novel.
So I love the idea of 30 circles, and my kids at this time of the year aren't extremely prepared to write words in the 30 circles, so they could draw pictures and turn them into, you know, a doggy face or Clifford or a donut or a muffin, and stick those, stick that sheet in their writing folders. And then when they get stuck, which happens quite often in first grade, they can pull that sheet out, that 30 circles sheet, and just find a picture. Say they look at Clifford, and then now they're going to turn that into a story. And for us at first grade, a story means we're working right now at this point in writing 3 sentences. And so they could see that picture of Clifford and think, you know, hey, I can write a story about Clifford and write my 3 sentences on Clifford.
Mm-hmm.
And that made me think, and Erica, you did this with like parts of speech, but as an idea organizer or kind of story inspiration generator, you could do that with any age level of kid, right? And have one column that's just quotes that you've heard, or like, you know, cool things that you've heard people say. And you just put one in the bubbles, and then another column could be like awesome places, magical and mysterious places. And then another one could be curious characters that you see around town or that you've thought of. And just every once in a while, like, kids are encouraged to keep adding to those bubbles, and they might not know why, but eventually they become that fodder for the game and the writing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I really like the idea of pictures. And I just, kids write really well from pictures. And
I use kind of your, the 30 bubbles, except I have a noun and verb cup or jar, if you will, and I use it backwards. So I have them pick a noun and a verb, and I use it for art during art class. They have to create a picture going with those two things.
So the next slide that you can see is the worksheet games. I don't know if this is really a game, but I was like, I think it kind of fits. So I'm just going to share. Because I took some sheets and took fabric paint and then just like drew out like the plot diagram. And then you could do like a Venn diagram, but then you kind of have it like as it then is a repeatable structure because you know it's on a sheet, and so then you just have little pieces of paper that you can then put it in, and it makes it really visible and also like tactile. So I don't know, I just think it's fun. Maybe it's not fully a game, but like a worksheet, like to make it so literal.
That's funny. And what the image that I got in my head was going to a thrift store and finding old kits of Twister and having a giant 30 circles thing up in the classroom.
Yeah. And then you could just have a whole collection thing going all year round. And then you could just go up and look at the mat. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so ideas for games. These are just what kind of things that I've been thinking about. They're in development right now because I've recently gone back to 7th grade, and these kids just need to move more. And so we've been bowling, but we've just been bowling with the acronym Be Original with Language. Because my grandma was a bowler, and this summer I found a whole bunch of bowling shirts. So on Fridays I've been wearing my bowling shirts, and then we've been taking one thing. They've been in our writing notebooks. They've been publishing one thing, which means they type it and then they send it to me in the Google Classroom. But then this week I upped the game and said you need to put a metaphor in. You couldn't just like publish it because the radar, radar is replace, add, delete, and reorder, which is I got from Kelly Gallagher at the conference. And so they had to add a metaphor, but I would actually like to make the game a little bit more kinesthetic, to actually like maybe bowl and like place other limits on it. But I don't know if that's like a thing that's going to happen, but just that idea of like game and adding an element of limits and fun and perhaps competition, because I also have a bunch of bowling trophies that I took from her garage. So I was thinking about having a trophy with like, this is the metaphor trophy, and so it's just be a traveling trophy, and so then it's just like, okay, these are you won the metaphor trophy. You got a great bowl. You were original, be original with language. But yeah, it's not quite there, but I don't know. And maybe I need to learn more from elementary teachers about how to move, like have more movement in the classroom, because I feel like elementary teachers do a good job.
I was on a math chat this summer, and one of the teachers on that chat shared this snowball game, and like all the math teachers knew about it, but I had never heard of it, which isn't saying anything. But I think you could modify it to do something like this and connect to your bowling idea, and they could make bowling balls. But what they did is when they were studying a math problem, a type of problem, students would have to take a blank piece of paper and write a problem on it. So maybe they write part of their story idea, or they write one phrase, or they share one of their ideas from their writer's notebook. And then everyone crumpled up their paper and then they like threw them around the room like a snowball fight. And then you ended up with a different snowball, and you opened it, and you had to finish whatever problem was on that piece of paper. So maybe you guys could bowl, and then everybody has to like find, or like there's some way of getting like bowling and crumpling paper. And these were high school teachers who were sharing this idea for math. And I was like, I could see why teenagers would enjoy throwing paper around the classroom.
I did something like that with theme statements a few years ago, but I don't even remember what I did. But yeah, it involved throwing paper around. So I like your thought with where this is going, where you could even like you could have your class be original with language, write down dialogue, or like someone could write down like characters. Like you could have like different corners, do those different elements like we were talking about with the 30 circles, and just kind of throw them at each other, and then they pick up those elements. Maybe like you have different colored paper, and then you pick up your story, like, oh, now everybody go get 2 oranges because you need a character. Okay, get a blue because you need a conflict. Something like that. That would be kind of cool.
And then everybody so you fill out your characters, and then like you toss those balls, and then you fill out your place, your setting, and you throw out those balls. Maybe one is mood or tone for something, or even genre of story. Like there would be all kinds of ways that you could, like mix that up, and you just have this confetti bubblegum ball machine kind of thing going on.
Huh. Well, it's funny that's because today in our like advisory, the activity was to write down a mistake that we made, and then to crumple it, and then to open it up, and then like color in the creases, because then it was supposed to represent that's the connections that your brain now made. You made that mistake, but now your brain has all these connections because you learned from it. And the kids were like, that was so awesome. That was so awesome. This was so awesome. So I think that they would definitely enjoy crinkling and throwing snowballs. Yeah. So. And then I guess I keep coming back to the concept of connecting the dots. And I really think that at the core, that's what writing is you have certain dots that you have deemed important, and then you just connect them. And that's what writing is. And so every once in a while I play around with different ways to just have that kind of be more visual, like just, literally put the dots up and then like just kind of graph it out. But it's, connecting dots, which I think that's what the 30 circles is, really just connecting the dots. And maybe that's why it's such a powerful organizer. And then that's what I had. But what games do you guys play? Because I know you guys must play.
I have a quick one to share. I saw your title that was worksheet games.
Mm-hmm.
You meant it in a literal worksheet. Sometimes I take the boring worksheets and I divide my class into teams, and I give them one of those please ring for service bells. I can't remember exactly what they're called, but and then I project it on my smart board, and I make each individual student, they're on teams, but they can only answer one at a time individually, if that makes sense. So that they're still, so that, the smart kids can't answer all the questions. And then the kids who don't get it just sit there, correct. And they were the first one to ring the bell. They get 1 point if they rung the bell and it was correct, but they were second. But if they were wrong at all, they have to subtract points. And then of course, in the end, it's whoever has the most points win. But they're really just doing the worksheet, and I call it a game and give them some bells, and they think it's the most fun thing ever. And it's more fun,
Mm-hmm.
I recently became an elementary teacher, so I went from teaching just English to teaching all the subjects, and I needed to find a creative way to teach vocabulary terms. So I ended up creating like a swap that game. So I would put a vocabulary definition or a definition of a place or a person on the board, and then they would divide into 2 teams, and they would be armed with meter sticks, which is very frightening with 6th graders. And the definition would appear on the board, as well as a few other vocabulary terms. And then as soon as they popped on the board, they would start like moving around on the board, and they would have to try to track it down with their meter stick and hit the correct one in order to get their team points. It really helped them learn their vocabulary terms. So get a stick in their hand, I guess.
I did this comma constructivist activity, and I've done it in 9th and 10th grade, and I think I even did it with my juniors one year. But I literally put together either manila envelopes or an actual, just a file folder. And then kids were paired up, and they each had a case that they had to solve. Instead of me explaining the rules, I gave them examples of if these sentences are correct and these sentences are incorrect, figure out, decode what is the comma rule. And then these detectives, the comma detectives, had to write a rule. So now I can just do it on like a shared Google slide deck or something. But back in the day, we just used the overhead projector. And so then they would have to answer a couple questions of figuring out, like they would have to write their rule and give example sentences of right and wrong. And then just over the course of several weeks, we would have a couple detectives come up and share how they cracked the case. And then all the rest of the students had to put like the case number and the rule in their writer's notebook. And so that's how I made learning comma rules a little bit of a game.
That reminds me, I forgot that I used to explain the difference between a comma and a semicolon. And I guess like in terms of the story, it was that like so many kids would use comma splices where they just needed a semicolon to separate the 2 complete sentences. So I said, guys, like the comma and a semicolon, if they were to meet in a dark alley, I said semicolon would win every time because the comma needs a conjunction with it. And I don't know, they seem to remember that. But then I was also maybe like more of a couched in the story. But yeah, I had forgotten about that until the commas.
I forgot about a game that I played with my social studies kids. It's a Destiny board game. So it has questions from the lesson that we learned, and then the top scorers, like the top 10, get to have a destiny, and they get to pick their number, and it's a huge deal. And it's their destinies are based on the historical time period that we're learning about. So the superintendent's kid picked like number 4 once, and her father sold her into slavery. And she died very poor. Another student got trampled by Julius Caesar's horses. And that's just something that I really look forward to. Like, what terrible thing or what really good thing will happen to the winners of this game?
Huh. I like that as a prize. It's a very educational and yet very like.
Oh yeah, they remembered.
Just learned about class craft. The science teacher, 7th grade science teacher, is going to be trying it out, but basically you set up quests. So it's kind of like, they use this, if you're in Google Classroom, like it'll connect, but then you can set kids on quests. So kind of like what you're saying, Lisa, about like, you know, like you are like this person because you create a character. But I'm very intrigued by it because it like sets up like different maps, and I just am learning about it. And then I'm learning about Dungeons and Dragons. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know what this was before, but really it's a story game that like people just create characters and then they come and they have a story all played out and they roll the dice. And I'm very intrigued by this.
We play a lot of trash get ball. So you can ask I mean, it's really across the board. You could use it for anything. Science, studies, really whatever. Ask them divide them into their teams, ask them questions, and then they love it when they get choice as well. So they can choose a 1 point, a 2 point, or a 3 point shot and tally up the points that way.
Did you have like lines for the 1.2 point?
You could. I just use objects in the room. Like the front of this table is 1 point. Where you get what I'm saying. At the end of the table, it's 3 points. And right here where this is on the table is 2 points. And we generally use the same spot because it's right behind the door and that's where the trash goes. Mm-hmm. Or even, let's say you read a story for reading and you're just going to ask a bunch of different leveled questions, you know, for comprehension or whatever. Just tossing a ball around. That way everybody's encouraged to participate and things like that.
I am originally an English teacher, and we did a lot of role play when it came to grammar. Whenever I taught nouns and adjectives, we were cavemen. So we would get into character and we would talk about the berries, and people would have to figure out like what kind of berries were we trying to find so that we could eat them and survive. And then for adverbs, we all became bosses because, you know, well, how early did you make it into school today? And then with, you know, the types of sentences, the interrogative, declarative, we did all sorts of characters, like they became an interrogative, and they had to be in a play where they could only ask questions, or the annoying kid was always exclamatory. And then we also do picture walkthroughs before we read a book. So I had heard from one presenter somewhere, I don't remember who it was, about how teachers often give too much of the book away before teaching it. So I think it's from actually a Spanish teacher gave me this idea, and she puts pictures up from the time period, and then the students do a gallery walkthrough looking at the pictures and then answering questions. I think it's from that Mosaic of Writing book. The kids have writing at each station with the different gallery photos. So it introduces them to the time period and the thought, and it gets them thinking prior to reading the book. And it's supposed to be a more engaging way of starting a text. And I've enjoyed it.
In 4th grade, we've started working on writing a rough draft for our personal narrative. And before they sat down to kind of start working on their draft, they would go around and they would rehearse their story and what they were going to say with a partner. And then they would switch partners and go to another partner. So not only are they sharing their story, but then they're also hearing somebody else's story. So it was a great way for them to kind of gather their thoughts and kind of remember all of the things that actually happened before they sat down to get it down on paper.
Did you, Christine, did you give them limits, or did you just say that to tell the story? Did you give them like time limits for when they're rehearsing?
You know what? I didn't, because we did one rehearsal one day with a partner, and then they would go and start working on their draft. And then the next day we started with a different partner. So I'm guessing if I try to do more than one partner in a day, then I would need to. Because yeah, some kids could go on and on and on, and other kids were done and ready to write.
I did get you some parting gifts for coming. I was like, man, if I'm hosting, I'd like to give you some gifts. So just 2 things as my parting gifts to you. Research assistant Zotero.org is a fantastic place for storing resources. It's probably more for a little bit higher level. I don't know if elementary would be using citations, but My other favorite thing that I don't know if other people know about is that unsplash.com has awesome, awesome copyright-free photos. Like professional photographers have gifted their pictures to unsplash.com. And you can credit, but you don't have to credit. And so, yes, those are my two parting gifts for you. Okay. Well, is that anything else, Darcy, or are we good to go for tonight?
I think I just have so many ideas buzzing around in my head. Thanks so much, Erica, for getting us percolating and getting our brains buzzing with some ideas for games for our classrooms.
Thank you, Erica. I am excited for new ideas.
Thank you, Erica.
You're welcome. I have new ideas too. And I was just like, I'm excited to see how this is all going to work. So